Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A simple delivery that changed everything. Darius Durant had been a mailman for nearly 3 years, a job that had become as much a part of him as the quiet streets of Copper Hill, the small suburban town he called home. His route was a daily rhythm he had grown to love, a predictable pattern of familiar faces, mailboxes, and driveways. Yet, in all his years of delivering letters and packages, Darius never expected that one simple delivery would alter the course of his day, and perhaps his life, forever. It was just another early morning. The air was crisp, the sun not yet fully risen above the horizon as Darius's alarm clock buzzed to life. He groggily reached for it, silencing the relentless sound, and blinked into the soft glow of the morning light creeping through his window. It was a routine that had become second nature to him over the years: get up, get dressed, grab a quick breakfast, and hit the road. Today, however, something felt off. Darius couldn't shake the feeling of unease as he pulled on his uniform and tied his shoes. He had no reason to feel this way, but a faint sense of dread lingered in the pit of his stomach. Perhaps it was the calm before the storm, or maybe it was just the weight of an unexplainable intuition. By 7 a.m., Darius was already at the post office, sorting through his deliveries with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent countless hours memorizing his route. His hands moved automatically, organizing letters and packages by address, while his mind wandered to the neighborhood he would soon traverse. Copper Hill was a quiet, peaceful place, one where everyone knew each other by name and the days blended together in a haze of mundane but comforting normalcy. Darius had always enjoyed the simplicity of his job. Each day was a series of small interactions, fleeting moments with the people who made up his town. He knew which families preferred their mail to be left at the back door, who had dogs that barked loudly but meant no harm, and which neighbors always had a kind word or a quick chat. It was the human connection that made his work fulfilling. And among the many faces Darius saw on his route, one stood out: Mrs. Jane Thompson. Mrs. Thompson had been a fixture in the Copper Hill neighborhood for as long as Darius could remember. The elderly woman had a way of making every encounter feel special, whether it was with a simple wave from her porch or the occasional chat about the weather, her garden, or the latest book she was reading. She was a widow, having lost her husband several years ago, but she never seemed lonely. Mrs. Thompson was the heart of her street, always caring, always smiling, always there. As Darius made his way through his morning deliveries, the memory of their previous interactions lingered in his mind. There had been the time she had brought him homemade cookies during the winter holidays, or the afternoon she'd invited him in for a cup of tea when he'd dropped off a package. She'd been like family to him in some ways, always caring, always interested in how his life was going. But today, as Darius pulled up to her house, something felt different. Mrs. Thompson's house sat at the end of Elm Street, an old brick cottage with ivy creeping up the walls and a white picket fence lining the yard. It had always been one of the most well-maintained homes on the street, the lawn mowed neatly, the flowers in bloom during the spring, and the porch steps swept clean. But today, something was off. The lawn was overgrown, the flower beds were untended, and a few weeds had started to peek through the cracks in the pavement. It was a subtle change, but enough to raise Darius's eyebrows. As he stepped out of his postal van, he noticed something else: a pile of newspapers had accumulated on the front step. They were yellowed from exposure to the sun, a clear sign that they had been there for several days. The thought that Mrs. Thompson might have forgotten to bring them inside was strange. She was always so punctual, so organized. Darius approached the front door with a small package in hand. He rang the doorbell, the chime echoing faintly through the house. He waited, listening for any sounds of movement from inside. But nothing. Not a shuffle, not a creak, not a whisper. He pressed the doorbell again, this time with more urgency. Still, there was no response. A growing sense of unease began to settle over him as he glanced at the overflowing mailbox. It, too, was a sign of neglect. Normally, Mrs. Thompson would collect her mail each afternoon, the papers neatly stacked in the box, and the door always ajar as she chatted with the neighbors. But now, the mailbox was stuffed to the brim with uncollected mail, the the envelope sticking out like forgotten memories. Darius knocked at the door, his fists pounding against the wood with more force. He could feel his pulse quickening, his mind racing through different possibilities. Was Mrs. Thompson sick? Had she gone away on a trip? Or was something else happening that he didn't understand? As he stood there, staring at the door, his concern deepened. Something wasn't right, and he could feel it in his gut. Mrs. Thompson was usually so quick to answer the door, always offering a friendly smile or a kind word. But today, the silence was deafening, and the lack of response felt wrong. Darius pulled out his notepad and wrote a quick note about the package. As he slipped it into the mailbox, he glanced up at the house again, scanning the windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mrs. Thompson. But there was nothing, no sign of life behind the curtains, no flicker of movement in the shadows of the home. He turned to leave, but something made him stop. His eyes caught sight of Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Thompson's neighbor, tending to his rose bushes next door. Darius walked over to the fence and greeted him. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins," Darius called, trying to mask the concern in his voice. "Morning, Darius. How are you today?" Mr. Jenkins replied, squinting in the bright sunlight. "I'm doing well, thanks. I was just wondering, have you seen Mrs. Thompson around lately?" Darius asked, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. Mr. Jenkins frowned, his eyes narrowing in thought. "You know, now that you mention it, I haven't seen Jane in a couple of weeks. She usually comes out to water her plants or take a walk, but I haven't seen her at all recently." Darius felt a knot form in his stomach. A couple of weeks. That was strange. Mrs. Thompson never missed a day of her routine. "Do you think everything's okay with her?" Darius asked, his voice tinged with concern. Mr. Jenkins scratched his chin, looking troubled. "I don't know, Darius. She's been a bit of a shut-in lately, but I always figured it was just because she didn't feel like going out. But now that you mention it. Yeah, it's been odd." The news hit Darius like a freight train. Mrs. Thompson hadn't been seen in weeks. That didn't make sense. She was too reliable, too consistent. Something was wrong. Darius forced a smile, trying not to let his worry show. "Thanks for the heads up, Mr. Jenkins. I'm sure everything's fine. Maybe she's just been under the weather." But as he walked back to his van, he couldn't shake the feeling that something much more serious was at play. Mrs. Thompson, always so active and engaged in her community, hadn't been seen for weeks. And now, Darius was left with the gnawing thought that he might be the only one who could do something about it. As he drove away from Elm Street, he couldn't stop glancing back in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see Mrs. Thompson's familiar figure standing on her porch, waving. But the house remained silent, empty, its windows dark and uninviting. The rest of his route passed in a blur, his mind consumed by the haunting image of Mrs. Thompson's house. What had happened to her? Where was she? And more importantly, was she in danger? The sun rose higher in the sky, but Darius couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Unseen shadows of concern. The rest of Darius's route felt like a blur, each house blending into the next as his mind repeatedly returned to Mrs. Thompson's house. Her absence weighed heavily on his thoughts. He couldn't ignore the unsettling image of the overflowing mailbox, the wilting flowers, and the eerie silence that had greeted him at her front door. He had spent the last several hours delivering mail to neighbors, but every knock, every greeting, felt detached, as though he were going through the motions without truly being present. His mind was too preoccupied with the growing sense of worry gnawing at him. By the time he finished the last stop on his route, it was mid-afternoon. The post office had already begun to quiet down for the day, and Darius was left to complete his usual paperwork before he could head home. Yet, his heart was far from the familiar comfort of his apartment. Instead, he found himself sitting in his van, staring at the steering wheel, unable to shake the feeling that Mrs. Thompson needed him. He knew he had to do something, but what? Darius's thoughts swirled, tugging at his conscience. He had been trained to deliver mail, to check the accuracy of addresses and ensure timely deliveries. That was his job. But today, something had changed. Mrs. Thompson, the friendly, lively woman he had come to know over the years, had disappeared into thin air. Was she ill? Had something happened to her? Darius's mind flashed to all the worst-case scenarios. What if she had fallen and couldn't get to the phone? What if she was too weak to reach out for help? What if something more sinister was at play? Darius pushed the door of his van open, the creak of the hinges punctuating the silence of the moment. The usual background hum of Copper Hill streets, birds chirping, distant conversations, the hum of lawnmowers, seemed muted today. There was no comfort in the town he had once thought of as a safe haven. Everything now seemed distant, almost hollow, in comparison to the concern slowly consuming him. He picked up his phone, hesitated for a moment, and then made a call. The number he dialed belonged to his supervisor at the post office, a kind woman named Sandy who had been supportive of him since his early days on the job. She was a steady voice in his life, always there with a solution when the routine of the job became overwhelming. This time, however, Darius had no simple problem to solve. This wasn't about missed deliveries or misplaced mail. It was about a woman he cared about, someone who might need help. "Sandy, it's Darius," he said, his voice uncharacteristically strained. "I need to take a few extra minutes today. I'm worried about one of the residents on my route. Mrs. Thompson, Jane Thompson, the elderly woman on Elm Street. I haven't seen her in a while, and something doesn't feel right." Sandy's voice was soft, but understanding. "Darius, I know you care about your route, but I'm afraid we can't just leave our jobs to check in on people. You know how it is. But, if you're really concerned, maybe you should consider calling someone else. Maybe the police or a neighbor could help." "I know, Sandy," Darius replied, his frustration rising. "But I have this gut feeling, you know? Something's wrong. I just need to be sure." There was a long pause on the other end. Sandy, who had been the voice of reason on many occasions, let out a sigh of what sounded like reluctant sympathy. "All right, Darius. If you're that concerned, go ahead. But make sure you're being safe. We need you on the job." With her reluctant blessing, Darius hung up the phone and let out a long, deep breath. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe reassurance, or an answer to all his questions, but now he had permission to act. His feet felt like lead as he walked back to his van, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he couldn't sit by any longer. He had to check on Mrs. Thompson. The drive back to Elm Street seemed faster than it had earlier, the familiar streets of Copper Hill blurring around him. Each second felt stretched out, as if time itself was conspiring to delay him. His heart pounded in his chest as he made the turn onto Mrs. Thompson Street. There it was, the small cottage with ivy creeping up the sides, the same house he had passed countless times before, but now it seemed different. Now, it seemed ominous. He parked his van a few houses down, not wanting to attract attention, and walked toward her home on foot. The closer he got, the more his unease grew. The air seemed heavier here, the familiar surroundings feeling like a mirage. He couldn't see anyone in the windows, and the porch, usually the center of Mrs. Thompson's daily life, was eerily empty. It was as if the house had fallen into a kind of suspended animation, trapped in a moment that didn't belong. He reached the front door and knocked again, this time with more urgency. When there was no answer, his worry escalated. The silence that hung in the air felt suffocating. He tried the doorbell, but even the faint sound of it felt like a cry for help that no one would hear. There had to be a way to get inside. Darius stepped back, glancing around the yard once more. He noticed a small window to the side of the house that was slightly ajar, just wide enough to fit his hand through. It wasn't much, but it gave him an idea. He approached the window and gently pushed it open, wincing as the hinges creaked loudly, like a warning. Inside, the house was dark, with only the faintest light filtering through the curtains. His heart raced as he scanned the interior, looking for any sign of Mrs. Thompson. It didn't take long for his eyes to settle on something that made his blood run cold. On the floor, just inside the doorway, he saw a trail of what looked like dark stains leading into the living room. His stomach lurched, and panic clawed at his chest. Could it be blood? Had she fallen and hurt herself? Without thinking, Darius pushed the window further open, ducking under the sill to crawl inside. The house was unnervingly quiet, and the smell of stale air clung to the walls. As he stood up and glanced around, the weight of the moment hit him hard. He wasn't supposed to be here, in this place where something felt so wrong, but he couldn't leave now, not when he feared for Mrs. Thompson's safety. He followed the trail of stains cautiously, trying to steady his breath. Each step seemed to echo in the emptiness, a stark contrast to the usual warmth he associated with this home. The living room was in disarray, with papers scattered across the floor and a few chairs overturned, as if there had been a struggle. The old clock on the wall ticked loudly, its sound now the only thing that seemed to break the stillness. Darius called out softly, "Mrs. Thompson? Are you here?" There was no response. The living room was silent, but then Darius's eyes landed on something, a dark figure huddled in the corner, partially obscured by a chair. He froze, fear and confusion mingling in his chest. Was it her? Or was it something else? Taking a deep breath, he approached cautiously, his mind racing with all the worst possibilities. The figure shifted slightly as he drew closer, and Darius's heart skipped a beat. "Mrs. Thompson," he whispered, the words barely escaping his throat. As he rounded the corner, his breath caught in his throat. What he saw stopped him in his tracks, a sight that would haunt him forever. A glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. Darius's heart hammered in his chest as he stepped closer to the shadowed figure in the corner. His every instinct screamed to run, to leave the house, to call for help. But something anchored him, a quiet urgency pulling him forward. He had to know what had happened to Mrs. Thompson. She had been a constant in his life, a source of comfort during his daily rounds, and he couldn't leave her fate hanging in the balance. The figure shifted again, and Darius's breath caught in his throat as the light from the hallway finally revealed a familiar face. Mrs. Thompson, but she was far from the warm, cheerful woman he remembered. Her once silver hair was matted and clinging to her scalp in tangled knots, her skin pale and drawn, as if drained of all vitality. Her clothes, those same soft, floral dresses that she always wore, were stained and disheveled, hanging loosely from her frail frame. For a moment, Darius simply stared, trying to process what he was seeing. She didn't look up, her eyes glazed over, unfocused. It was as if she was in a trance, lost in a world that Darius couldn't access. She barely registered his presence as he knelt down beside her. "Mrs. Thompson," he said gently, reaching out a hand to touch her arm. "It's Darius, the postman. Are you okay?" She flinched at his touch, but the reaction was weak, as if her body no longer had the energy to respond fully. Her gaze flickered toward him, but it was distant, like she was seeing him through a haze. It took several long seconds for her to speak, her voice, barely a whisper, hoarse and frail. I didn't want anyone to know," she murmured, her words slow and slurred. "I thought I could manage on my own." Darius's heart broke at the sound of her voice, so unlike the vibrant woman he remembered. "Manage what, Mrs. Thompson? What happened?" Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. She stared at him, the weight of her unspoken words pressing heavily between them. Darius's mind raced, trying to piece together the mystery of her sudden isolation and the strange state she was in. Had she been alone this entire time? Had no one noticed her disappearance, her growing frailty? "I fell," she said after a pause, her eyes blinking as though struggling to focus. "I thought it was just a bruise, just a little pain. But it didn't get better. I couldn't get up. No one came. I couldn't call." Darius felt his stomach tighten as he realized the depth of her isolation. Mrs. Thompson had been suffering for days, maybe even weeks, without anyone noticing. No one had come to check on her, not until Darius's persistent worry had pushed him to act. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, gently lifting her frail body from the floor, trying to support her weight. Her body felt like it weighed nothing, as though it had withered from lack of care. His heart ached with the realization that this woman, once a pillar of the neighborhood, had quietly suffered in her own home unnoticed and alone. She had been there, just a few feet away from all of them, but no one had seen. Darius's mind snapped into action. He knew he couldn't let her stay there any longer. She needed help, immediate help. He gently helped her to her feet, supporting her as best as he could, but her strength was barely there. Her frail limbs shook with each movement, and he could feel the coldness in her skin, the signs of someone who had been deprived of care for far too long. "Hold on, Mrs. Thompson," Darius said, his voice firm now, a sense of urgency replacing his earlier hesitation. "I'm calling for help. You're not alone anymore." He reached for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed 911. As the phone rang, the weight of the moment settled over him. He was about to ask for help, but in that moment, Darius realized how much more he needed to be a part of the solution. He couldn't simply wait for others to act. He had to be her advocate, her lifeline. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered on the other end of the line. Darius's voice was tight as he explained the situation. "There's an elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, she's in bad shape. She's been alone for days. I found her in her home, and I think she needs medical attention right now." The operator was quick to respond, asking for details about Mrs. Thompson's condition and location. Darius provided all the information he could, watching helplessly as Mrs. Thompson swayed on her feet, her frail form supported by his arm. "Help is on the way, Darius," the operator assured him. "Stay with her, and do not let her move too much. Make sure she stays as comfortable as possible. We're sending an ambulance to her location now." Darius nodded, even though the operator couldn't see him. He hung up the phone and looked at Mrs. Thompson, her eyes still unfocused but now filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place, perhaps relief, perhaps something deeper. "Help is coming," Darius whispered, trying to comfort her. "You're going to be okay. I won't let anything happen to you." Mrs. Thompson barely seemed to hear him, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a faint glimmer of trust. She didn't have the strength to speak anymore, but Darius could sense she understood. The worst was over. She wasn't alone. As Darius continued to hold her steady, the silence in the room felt different now. Less heavy. There was still so much unknown about what had transpired in the days leading up to this moment, but Darius had done what he needed to do. He had acted when others hadn't, and now she was going to get the care she so desperately needed. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The quiet hum of Copper Hill outside seemed so far away, so distant from the urgency inside Mrs. Thompson's home. Darius sat with her, not speaking, simply ensuring that she felt the presence of someone who cared. In the midst of all the isolation she had faced, Darius had become the one thread of connection that had pulled her back from the edge. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the stillness. Darius's heart lifted with relief, and as the emergency responders burst into the house, he stood up, making way for them. They moved quickly, expertly assessing Mrs. Thompson's condition, preparing her for transport. Darius stepped back, feeling a sense of helplessness now that the professionals were in charge. He watched as they gently placed Mrs. Thompson on a stretcher, the soft hum of the medical equipment mixing with the low murmur of voices in the room. As the paramedics prepared to take her away, one of them turned to Darius. "You did the right thing, calling us," the medic said with a reassuring nod. "We'll take it from here. She's in good hands." Darius felt a weight lift from his chest as Mrs. Thompson was wheeled out of the house. Her frail body was finally receiving the care it needed. The thought of her alone and in pain for so long felt like a distant nightmare now, one that had been chased away by his decision to act. Before the ambulance drove off, Darius stood in front of Mrs. Thompson's house, watching it disappear into the distance. It had been a day unlike any other, a day that had started with simple deliveries and ended with the rescue of a woman who had been forgotten by the very community that had once known her so well. He didn't know what the future held for Mrs. Thompson, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never forget the lesson this day had taught him. People matter. Their stories, their struggles, their pain, it all matters. No matter how small the act, no matter how brief the moment of connection, it could change everything. He had saved Mrs. Thompson today, but more importantly, he had learned that sometimes, all it takes to make a difference is to notice the things that others overlook. A new beginning. Days passed since the ambulance had whisked Mrs. Thompson away, and life in Copper Hill returned to its steady rhythm. The sun rose and set, the streets filled with the usual hum of activity, families rushing to school, children playing in the park, and neighbors chatting over fences. Yet, in Darius's mind, the world felt different now. Mrs. Thompson's face, the emptiness in her eyes, the frailty of her body, was something he couldn't shake. It was a haunting image, one that kept replaying in his mind like an old, forgotten tune. But there was also a sense of hope that lingered, a feeling that the community had woken up from its slumber, that the unnoticed had been seen, and that the forgotten had been found. It was a few days after Mrs. Thompson had been taken to the hospital that Darius received a call from the local nursing home. They told him that Mrs. Thompson was recovering well and had begun to regain her strength. The doctors had confirmed that she had suffered from severe malnutrition, dehydration, and the effects of an untreated fall. But the most encouraging news was that she had been stabilized, and her spirits were slowly improving. She had been asking for Darius, asking who had found her, who had cared enough to help her. When Darius heard the news, a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying lifted from his shoulders. Mrs. Thompson was going to be okay. She wasn't going to fade into the background of the neighborhood's forgotten corners. She was going to make it. A week later, Darius stood outside the nursing home, his heart pounding as he took in the familiar building. It was a modest place, with a well-kept garden and a few benches where residents could sit in the sun. The atmosphere was calm, peaceful, even a far cry from the chaos of the hospital. He had made arrangements to visit Mrs. Thompson, and today was the day. He had been eager to see her, to hear her voice again, to know that she had found a new sense of peace. When he walked into the small, sunlit room where she was staying, Darius was greeted by the sight of Mrs. Thompson sitting in a chair by the window, her silver hair now neatly combed, her face much brighter than he had seen it in weeks. She looked up as he entered, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a smile spread across her face, a true smile, not the faint, distant expression he had seen before, but one that was warm, full of life. "Darius," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I knew you would come." Darius stepped into the room, his heart swelling with relief. "I'm so glad to see you, Mrs. Thompson. How are you feeling?" "I'm better," she replied with a quiet chuckle. "I've got a long way to go, but I'm getting there. They tell me I'll be out of here soon, and then I can go back to my garden, maybe start with some new flowers." "I'm happy to hear that," Darius said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was so worried about you." Mrs. Thompson's smile faltered for a moment, a shadow crossing her face. "I didn't mean for you to worry. I didn't want to trouble anyone. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I was wrong." Darius took a step closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do everything alone, Mrs. Thompson. We're all here for you. And I'm glad you let me help." Her eyes glistened with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, her strength and resilience shining through. "You were the only one who noticed, Darius. You were the only one who cared enough to check. Everyone else, they were too busy with their own lives. But you saved me." "I just did what anyone would do," Darius replied, a slight blush creeping across his cheeks. "You're part of this community, Mrs. Thompson. You matter. And I'm just glad I was there when you needed me." Mrs. Thompson nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I've been thinking a lot, Darius, while I've been here. About how we go through life, how we get so caught up in our own problems and forget the people around us. I know I wasn't the best at asking for help, but you reminded me that it's okay to rely on others. That we're all in this together." Her words resonated deeply with Darius. The truth of it echoed in his mind, like a powerful revelation. He had always believed in the importance of small acts of kindness, but this experience had shown him something even greater, the profound impact one person could have on another simply by noticing, by showing up. "You've taught me something, too," Darius said quietly. "That sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us. I didn't realize how much I took for granted before, how important it is to take the time to truly see the people around us. We can make a difference in ways we don't even realize." Mrs. Thompson smiled again, her eyes soft with gratitude. "You've got a good heart, Darius. Never forget that." The conversation continued, light and easy, but underneath the words was something deeper, something both Darius and Mrs. Thompson could feel, a bond formed in the most unlikely of circumstances, one that transcended age, background, and the routines of everyday life. As Darius left the nursing home that day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a deep understanding of how fragile and interconnected life truly is. He had stepped into the unknown, driven by a hunch, by a concern for someone he barely knew. And in doing so, he had changed the course of Mrs. Thompson's life, and perhaps his own. He had saved her that day, but in many ways, she had saved him too. She had reminded him that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply notice, to care, and to act when others might not. In a world that often feels disconnected, these small moments of connection are what truly matter. And as Darius drove home that evening, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that, for Mrs. Thompson, a new chapter had begun, a chapter filled with healing, hope, and the reminder that no one should ever have to face their struggles alone.